So the Switch launched in 2017 as this much needed course correction for the Wii U. And it launched alongside one of the biggest, just most generous, lush versions of Zelda that we've ever seen. And pretty much right out of the gate, Nintendo's new portable console hybrid just sold gangbusters, and really that's still true today in 2022, and it just continues to top the sales charts month after month. And lately I've been doing a whole lot of videos on the new hybrid on the block with Valve's Steam Deck, even going so far as to do a comparison video showing the pros and cons of both systems if they had to face off, in a battle to the death. Spoiler alert, it wasn't really a battle to the death, they're both amazing systems. But when I was making that video, specifically when I was filming a bunch of the B-roll cutaway footage of Horizon Chase Turbo on that system, it really got me thinking about how the Switch really is half a decade old at this point. And in turn, it got me excited to make a video about what my journey with the Switch has been like. So that's really what I wanted to get into today, is talk a little bit about my personal journey with the Nintendo Switch, starting at its humble beginnings back in 2017, through some of the highlights in the middle of the system's lifecycle, all the way up to present to talk about where I stand with the Switch today and what I think about the future of Nintendo's handheld. But for now, let's just go ahead and start right at the beginning and talk about when I actually got my Switch, and I got it at a midnight launch at Best Buy right when the system came out. Actually, now that I think about it, let me back up. That's not technically the first time that I had experience with the Switch. It really would have been that first press conference where they showed it off a few weeks prior. And coming off of the Wii U, I was a little bit skeptical about the device. I thought it held a lot of promise and everything that I was seeing looked really cool, but I was worried that Nintendo might not be able to deliver on it. But thankfully, I was super wrong, and I did go to the midnight launch of that system, and the game that I was most excited to get was the same one that everyone was excited to get, and that was Breath of the Wild. And I gotta say, I was totally obsessed with Breath of the Wild when it first came out, and I think I put about 140, 150 hours into it in those first few months. And I think that's because, to me, it felt like it totally revitalized Zelda and also the open world genre at the same time. It was just really refreshing to step into this big, beautiful open world and really feel like there was a true sense of discovery that was happening, instead of just feeling like my hand was being held as I made my way from just, one map marker to the next. And I have to say, Nintendo could not have chosen a better launch title for that system. Now, even though Breath of the Wild was a whole lot of fun, one of the problems I did have with the Switch right out of the gate was that there really weren't a lot of games to play out of the gate. I think there was like 7 or 8 titles, and not a lot of them were great. Even in that launch window, it was pretty slim there for the first couple of months. There were certain games that were out, like 1-2 Switch, or Snipper Clips, or Bomberman, but none of those really grabbed me in any significant way. The only other 2 games that really spring to mind when I think about those first few months with the Switch that were not Breath of the Wild, the first would have been Binding of Isaac, which obviously was a port from the PC version, and the other, for me, would have been my first time playing Shovel Knight, which was an amazingly good time, but it was also a holdover from the Wii U and it had been on other platforms at that point. Now that is a stark contrast to the Wii U, which I think launched with something like 38 games when it first came out, but then it sort of burned out quickly. So I think really what we were seeing there was Nintendo learning its lesson, realizing that the best approach would be to drip feed high quality titles to sustain the hardware throughout its life cycle in those first starting months, rather than to just give everybody a huge, push of games all at once, and then the system would be kind of devoid of any support there for a while. I think that was definitely a smart move on Nintendo's part, but still, those early months did feel a little bit desolate if you weren't playing Breath of the Wild. But hey, despite those early slim pickings, I'm pretty sure I and just about everybody else could see that the system had massive potential, and that sooner or later third-party developers were going to latch onto it, and predictably, the Switch started to take off like crazy in the middle of its life cycle, and then we just started getting a massive amount of games, and I didn't even mind that a lot of them were holdovers from the Wii U era, and some of the games that I was personally excited about would have been like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, or Stardew Valley, Darksiders, Dark Souls, Saints Row the Third, the Bioshock collection. I mean, there were just a ton of games that just kept getting ported to the Switch, and considering that was really my go-to at the time, and I was moving around a lot and I wanted my gaming on the go, it was a great time to be a fan of that platform. But ports and third-party offerings aside, we were still getting a lot of amazing either raw or timed exclusives for the Nintendo Switch that were also just jaw-dropping. Games like Astral Chain, or Octopath Traveler, or this gorgeous reimagining of Link's Awakening, and not to mention a very, just way too long-awaited follow-up to Luigi's Mansion in Luigi's Mansion 3. And then we finally got a new 2D Metroid game in Metroid Dread. Not to mention some absolute behemoths like new Pokemon games, or Animal Crossing, or just some really incredible port work with games like Doom. And then beyond games, we also started getting a better value proposition for Nintendo Switch Online. Now to be fair, in the early days of the console, you could just play online for free, which I always thought was a really nice part of the Nintendo ecosystem, but times changed, and eventually I guess they had to go to a subscription model as well, and to be fair, it was cheaper than what you would have gotten from Microsoft or Sony for their respective platforms. And they sweetened the deal there by offering things like cloud saves, which admittedly were a little bit clunky in my personal opinion, and they finally let us start playing a bunch of old Nintendo games from across multiple hardware generations. Granted, the emulation for a lot of those systems is not the best, but still, at least Nintendo was finally making an effort to bring their online offerings up to modern standards, and that was definitely welcome again after years of them just kind of doing okay with their online offerings. It was nice to see them at least, again, making an effort. And in typical quirky Nintendo fashion, we also got some real oddities too, right? Like Nintendo Labo, or Ring Fit Adventure, or Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. And most recently, we even got a new Wii Sports of sorts for those of us that were nostalgic for, the simplicity of Wii bowling in like 2006. And I have to say, my excitement for the system remained pretty consistent right up until about 2020, and I would say that's where things started to take a little bit of a downturn for me in terms of just like my regular excitement for the Switch as a platform. For starters, the whole world shut down, as we're all familiar with. Then at the end of 2020, we also got the PlayStation 5 and the Series X launches, which, naturally, if a new console comes out, especially one that's as powerful as those two systems, there's going to be a lot of hype for it, and of course it's going to take away some of your attention from the thing that you've been playing for years to the shiny new thing that just dropped with a whole bunch of new games and experiences. And speaking personally, when those systems came out, I definitely started playing my Switch a lot less. I'm not going to say that I never returned to the Nintendo Switch, I'm just saying that by and large, the fact that I was spending a lot more time at home, like a lot of people were, and the fact that I have the shiny new PlayStation 5 and Series X to mess around with meant that a lot of those third-party games and ports that I used to be so excited about for the Switch didn't quite hold the same luster or appeal as they once did back in, say, 2018 or 2019. So where does that leave me today with the Switch? Well, I'd say that I still keep a pretty close eye on any of their first-party releases or exclusives, obviously, because again, that's the only place you're going to get those experiences. But again, in the wake of the PS5, Series X, and more recently the Steam Deck, I will say that there's a lot more competing for my gaming attention than what was available just a few years ago that would have kept me more glued to the Switch. Don't get me wrong, I'm still pumped for games like Splatoon 3, Live Alive, or Breath of the Wild, of course, but the Switch is definitely not my go-to anymore whenever I think about multi-platform releases and where I'm actually going to end up playing them. Not to mention there are some problems with the Switch that have gone largely unaddressed, right? Like the Joy-Con is still a problem years later and Nintendo really hasn't done much about it. And again, the online system is kind of clunky to use when you've got better options out there. Now, neither of those are indictments that are just so egregious that you would just kind of dismiss the Switch wholesale or anything like that, but those little things do tend to add up in the back of your mind, especially if you're a multi-platform gamer and choosing, where you're going to have that next game experience that's coming out. But I mean, that makes sense, right? The Switch is not necessarily in its prime anymore. It's getting to the point now where we're kind of starting to expect what that next successor to the Switch will be, and I'm sure Nintendo's going to deliver, and I have to hand it to them, even though it feels like the Switch is getting closer and closer to its sort of swan song where we're going to kind of send it off in favor of the next new shiny thing that they put out from a hardware perspective. You can't say that Nintendo isn't just doing everything that it can to completely support this. There are a ton of new games that have been announced. There are still some heavy hitters that we have yet to see, like, again, Breath of the Wild 2 or Metroid Prime 4, which, we're still waiting on that. So at the end of the day, even though I do think the Switch is not quite as exciting and alluring to me as it once was, I'm still very excited for the future of what Nintendo has to offer, because I'm fairly certain that whenever Nintendo does get around to announcing the Switch's successor, that it's going to address some of the issues that I've had with the original platform, and probably just reignite that hype train all over again for me. So to wrap this whole thing up, I would say that the Switch had a really great start, an amazing middle, and a really strong finish that's also serving as this transitionary period as we get ready for the Switch 2 or Switch Pro or whatever they call it, that I'm positive will be backward compatible with all the other Switch games. But hey, what about you? What has your personal journey been like with the Nintendo Switch? Have your thoughts and feelings changed about the system over time? If so, what influenced that? Was it stuff like the Steam Deck? Was it other consoles that, had more graphical prowess, was just more enticing to you? If so, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the videos. It means a lot to me. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one.